last week I made some broccoli for my daughter, Sicilian style, just a little bit of olive oil and garlic and salt. And we had some brand new salt I've never used before. My wife bought it. It's called Celtic sea salt. I'd never even heard of it until last week. Um, I made the broccoli, put the salt on, tasted it. It tasted too salty. And I didn't really think that I put too much salt on. I stirred it up, tried another piece, and it was still too salty. And I thought, that's weird. So I gave the broccoli to my daughter. My wife had some also, and I got some feedback that it was just too salty. And that really bothered me because I don't like it when I make food that isn't good. And it stuck with me. The very next day, I was still thinking about it. It still disturbed me that I put too much salt on the broccoli. And so I started to think that maybe the Celtic sea salt is more salty than what we've been using. And honestly, I didn't really know if that was even a possibility. I have noticed in the past that certain types of salt doesn't seem to be quite as salty. For a while there, we were using that Redmond mineral salt out of Utah, and it seemed like that was not quite as salty as regular Morton's table salt. And so, anyways, I took this as an opportunity to learn more about salt. I did a deep dive. I went down a rabbit hole after rabbit hole with salt, and I'm going to tell you what I've learned. Kind of interesting, actually. So I made a few spreadsheets here you can look at. The first one, you're going to notice that the sodium, okay, so salt is sodium and chloride, but the saltiness taste is a result of how much sodium is in the salt. And so when you look at the nutritional facts, you're going to have the sodium listed. And this is what I came up with, a few different types of salt. And you're going to see that a serving is a quarter teaspoon, yet the amount of sodium per serving varies tremendously. So take a look at that. And I thought that was strange, so I dug deeper. And what I came up with was this. Look at the next slide. When you look at the serving size weight, that varies tremendously from one brand to another. And the reason is because the more a salt is refined, and the table salt is the most refined salt. And so table salt is refined into smaller granules. But kosher salt, for example, is much larger, has larger granules. And so what that means is these larger granules with these jagged angles and crevices and whatever, they don't compact as closely together. The next slide here, I just wanted to compare these four. You'll notice that each one, well, at least 3 out of the 4 have a totally different sodium amount per serving. But when you look at the weight and do the math, it's actually, they all contain the same amount of sodium. And so what's going on here, if you look down at the Diamond Crystal Kosher, their serving size is only 0.7 grams because it's the largest crystals and they just don't compact tightly together. But it's the same amount of salt. There's same amount of sodium per weight, as you'll see. And so you go online, and most Americans, they don't cook using weights like the Europeans do. And so you go online and they have these conversion calculators where you can, if a recipe calls for X amount of weight of Diamond Crystal Kosher, you can convert it to Morton Kosher or Morton Table Salt or vice versa. It's a lot easier just to use the scales, in my opinion, but Americans don't typically have scales in their kitchen. So let's pull up the full chart here. And you're going to see that there's still some variation, even percentage of salt. See that third column over, the percentage of salt that is sodium by weight. Most salt brands are the same until you get down to Redmond. And that's got a lower percent of sodium by weight. And I believe that's because there's so many minerals. It's mined out of the ground in Utah. And it has a really like a deep red color. So there's just other minerals in there that take up some weight. So it's slightly less salty. Now, you look at the Kona sea salt one on the bottom, and this has the lowest salt percentage by weight. But they were they're the only one that actually listed the amount of chloride in there. And so when you add up the sodium and the chloride together, that constitutes 78% of the weight of the salt. Now they pride themselves on how they mine the salt, or not how they mine it, sorry, how they extract it from the ocean. They actually pump the seawater from very deep down, and it has all sorts of silt and deep earth minerals in it. So they pump it up, they let it dry out, and then they let the water evaporate, and they've got the salt left over. And I've never tried the Kona sea salt. I want to now. But what's interesting is, though, you look at the Celtic. I put 2 different brands of Celtic sea salt on there, and they have lower percentage of salt, or lower percentage of sodium in the salt. So that made me curious, because to me that was the saltiest tasting salt I ever had. That's the one I used on the broccoli that made it too salty. And so I dug deeper, and I came up with this article by a PhD explaining why the Celtic sea salt is so salty. And to be honest, I read this article and I reread it and reread it and reread it, and the very crux of her argument was not super clear to me. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense, was not written very clearly. But from what I can gather, what she is saying is basically the way that the Celtic sea salt is harvested is they pump the seawater into these big open areas and let the water evaporate. Now, typically, when people are harvesting salt, the salt is going to be totally dry when they package it up and ship it off. But what the Celtic sea salt miners or harvesters are doing is she said that it's like 10% moisture when they package it up, and so there's more water in there, and so part of that weight is water weight, and that throws off the whole thing, the whole ratio. And so over time, when the water evaporates, then you've got a more concentrated salt. And so according to her estimate, doing her math, which didn't make any sense to me, but she says the Celtic sea salt is actually 31% saltier than table salt. And although the math didn't make a lot of sense to me, I'd have to agree with that result. I just put very little salt on that broccoli, and it tasted too salty. So I got to agree with her conclusion, even though I don't really totally understand how she got there. Now, you look at the Kona sea salt, and they have also very low sodium by weight percentage. And I don't know, I couldn't find anything if they're doing it the same way the Celtic harvesters are. Maybe they are. Maybe that's why the percentage of sodium is so low. Or maybe it's just because there's other minerals and other substances in that salt, the Kona sea salt. I don't know. I have to dig deeper. But really what we got to learn here is, what we're taking away here is that salt does vary. If you look at the top 4 on the chart here, top 4 or 5, you'll see the percentage of salt that is, cut. If you look at the top 4 or 5 here, the percentage of salt that is sodium is very comparable by weight. So if you're using your scales, you shouldn't have any problem intermixing those first 4 or 5 types of salt with your recipe, because you're going to dissolve the salt in the water, and that would make it all the same, right? If you're doing that, it doesn't matter if you're using kosher salt or table salt. If you measure by weight, dissolve in water, then the actual percentage of salt that is sodium is the same, or very close to the same, and that should not affect your pizza or whatever else you're making. But when you get down to the Himalayan, Redmond, Celtics, you'll see that it's just different. And so the big takeaway here is the type of salt that you do use does matter. Your recipe may need to be adjusted. And that's it. That's what I learned. My recipes that I've been putting on there, I'm just using table salt. That's just what I've had recently in the kitchen. And that's it. So I would love to hear some feedback from you guys. I want to know if you agree with me that the Celtic salt is that much saltier tasting than the other types. Any other observations you've used with salt? But that's the big takeaway, is your recipes will have to be tweaked just a little bit if you change the type of salt. Thank you.